very excited for it's the world premiere tomorrow. It's really exciting. Yeah, it's so cool.
I'm a little bit scared.
Okay, well, we're going to help you with that. Willie White, you are here in two capacities. You're here as a panelist, and you are a producer and a content creator, but you're also one of our sponsors. You're part of Indian Collective, which is an organization that is doing great things in Indian country. And you're somebody who I have never heard a person say a poor thing about. Like, you're one of those people that every single person that speaks of you just lights up. So I know that you're, somebody who's really doing great things in your community. And most recently, you just wrapped on co-producing a feature film that was directed by the actress Riley Keough, and it's called Beast. I'm just curious. I'm so excited because we need producers. I'm speaking as a producer. We really need people from the community who are producing content, in addition to directing and writing and actors. So I'm really excited to hear about your journey and excited about the film and how you guys made that film at Pine Ridge, which is where you're from, correct? Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, I'm Pati Washte, Chante Washte Nape Chuzapalo, Willie White and Machapi. Greetings, everyone. I shake your hand from one heart. And I'm just really grateful to be here and grateful that I'm able to be a part of this really great collective of people. Like Heather said, I come from the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and I've been wanting to be a filmmaker since I was 13, and I just recently turned 30, and I was freaking out a little bit because it's that new decade, but also reminded there was a reason why I stuck to storytelling and what that means to me as a person from Pine Ridge. When you kind of grow up on a reservation, there's a lot of isolation, and you almost feel like you're in a vacuum and there's no one there and there's no resources, and so you're constantly trying to find strength in your own voice and in your own perspective, and that's kind of been the journey I've been on, and I've been really grateful for the relationships in my life that have given me opportunity and who have held doors open for me and allowed me to walk through them at my own pace. Because sometimes when a door is open, you can't just start through. Sometimes it depends on the person. Sometimes it takes a little courage and a little strength to get to that space where you're like, okay, I'm ready for this. And that's kind of been my journey in being a filmmaker and a storyteller and figuring out what that means to me. And then more recently, in the past 5 years, I've been getting into community organizing work and working for organizations that are place-based in Pine Ridge around narrative change and what that means to tell our story from the community. And really, really bring in community to write that, to write those stories. And now I get to work for an organization like Indian Collective, whose mission is about building the collective power of Indigenous peoples, communities, nations, right? And making sure that all of that is built on the foundation of equity and justice for all people on the planet. And that's a huge thing. And to be a part of that creative team around narrative change, and to see Indians' investment in narrative change work, right? To bring on producers and creatives and not have a traditional communications and marketing team, but to really think about and be conscious of how we're telling our stories within communities and making sure that we are bringing in those voices. And so it's just been a really great honor, and to have worked with Riley and Gina, who both directed this film, to bring me on board, to trust in me as a community member of Pine Ridge, to help them bring this story to life, which took me a little while to warm up to. But when you understand how the core of it came from the community, it was a multiple of voices that came together to tell this story and to understand how important that story was to them and their voices. Sold me, and I was like, this is important. And that's been the movement for me too. It's like what Wilmer said, it's not we're trying to fight for a seat at the table, and Ava DuVernay says this as well. It's like we're building our own table and we're bringing our own chairs to that table, and that's the work I'm passionate about.
Brilliant, thank you. Michelle, you have a history with Sundance. You've been a fellow, and you've had films in the festival, including a short film that you directed that won the Grand Jury Prize, right? They won the Short Jury Prize. No, that mic is not on.
Okay, it actually, the honorable mention in international short filmmaking.
Got it, okay. And then you, I just want to do a shout out for the Vice series Rise. I'm not sure who of you saw Rise. Absolutely, yeah. 8-hour documentary series on global indigenous activism. And Michelle, you produced and directed all 8 of those episodes, correct? I mean, you showrun that series.
Yes.
Which is amazing. And as well, you just completed, you just wrapped on the first season of a television series, Trickster, in Canada. And so you are now a showrunner, you know, an Indigenous showrunner, one of very few, correct? So, yeah. It's amazing. And then you were just the screenwriter in residence at the Sundance Screenwriters Lab, coming in the week, you know, before coming here. So you're up to a lot. And you're multi-hyphenate, so you're, you know, you are deeply woven into the process, and I think you have a lot to say about it. I'm just curious, you know, being here, particularly coming out of the lab, how you feel.
I honestly, without a doubt, the lab is one of the highlights of my professional development and career. I've just never thought that I would end up in a room with all these incredible writers and talented people, and I just find whenever you have a chance to connect, and Sundance has really been that place for me, that, and I'm the Imaginative Film Festival in Toronto, Canada, when you have a chance to connect with other people and kind of, I guess, spark each other's inspiration and learn and make connections where you can read each other's scripts or offer feedback or go to each other's screenings, it's like that community is what's supported my development and my confidence, to be honest. And I want to shout you out, Heather, because you executive produced the Standing Rock films on the Rise series, and Justin over there with his camera up to his eye, he also worked on the Rise series as well, and we've actually worked on 5 films together. So, yeah.
That's wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Shandine, you also have been a Sundance Fellow and have been doing a lot of great work. You have a film, a short film that you wrote and directed, Mud, which has been on the festival circuit over this past year, and it's taken you many, many places. You also, in addition to being a writing director, I know you're working on your first feature script right now, but in addition, you're a cinematographer, and a really talented cinematographer and photographer, and you have an extraordinary eye. And so you as well are this kind of multi-hyphenate, but you're finding your way, and it's really beautiful, and I'm just curious how you're feeling now, and what you're up to, and how the writing's going, and all of that.
Yeah, thank you for having us here, and thank you for putting together this panel, and thank you all for being here. Yeah, Heather kind of said everything, but I think the best thing about being in this space is that other Indigenous people are here, and we all have stories that are very different, and it's just nice to kind of be able to connect with other people on a level of understanding and feeling like you have like a space of comfort and other people to rely on when it comes to your own storytelling, your own version of like whoever you are, writer, director, producer, anything. And it's just so great to be here. And yeah, I guess I'll just thank you.
Okay. Yes. Joey Pitts, you are a very talented, funny man.
Thank you.
I'm sure you have bad days along the way somewhere. But you have, you know, you're doing something that I think is really important, which is you're doing an intervention into the space and bringing comedy to the forefront. You're in LA, you're in the comedy scene, you're pushing boundaries and pushing through. I don't know if you're all familiar with this podcast recently. It went viral, but basically it was a gamers podcast where Joey, you know, went onto the podcast, talked about gaming, super like cool, you know, knowledge of his whole world. And
I'm a nerd, I like video games.
And then basically just like gave it to the host of the podcast. I'll let you tell the story, you know, if you want to, but it was a really interesting moment because you confronted something in such a clever and genuine, but yet unapologetic kind of way. And the result of the conversation was good, you know, you moved something. So I have a lot of respect for, you know, for the work that you're doing, not just as a comedian and a performer and a writer, but also like a big thinker, you know. So I'm very glad to have you here.
Thank you. My story, I'm an enrolled member of the Cowlitz Indian tribe. I grew up on the Tulalip Indian Reservation in Washington State. And I find myself in a position where, like, I moved to Los Angeles about 10 years ago, and I got really involved in the improv sketch comedy scenes at the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater, Groundlings, Second City, places like that. And I've written on shows for, like, Nickelodeon, DreamWorks, and a lot of other places. And I'm, like, one of very few Native American comedy people that gets opportunities in sort of the alt comedy space. So the podcast that Heather was talking about, it's part of a big podcast network called Earwolf. I was asked as the only Native American person they'd ever asked to do the show to review a game called Custer's Revenge. That is, I'm not going to go into details, but let's just say trigger warning, it's not, it's a horrible game. And they asked me to do that for the Thanksgiving episode. And once again, that podcast never deals with racial issues. I'm the only Native person I'd ever asked to do the show. And I was even like friends with a lot of these people. So instead of telling them no, I went on the show and then just flat out called them out about why what they did was not the coolest thing to do. And we just had like a real ass conversation, like live on the podcast about like, you know, why it's like not a good idea to only bring Native American people onto situations like that as like educators. Also, you know, the 10 other things that were weird and wrong with being asked to be in that situation. You know, to their credit, they engaged, we had the conversation, and like 10 minutes afterwards, they sent me very apologetic, genuine emails. They gave me final edit on the podcast episode because they knew that what I did was a really stressful thing for me to do. And they even, one of the things that I mentioned on the show is that like, I wanted them to invite Native American guests on the show, just like to talk about things not related to Native stuff, just to be normal guests, not like the token Native. And then I also wanted them to bring Natives on, you know, not around Thanksgiving, because we're around the rest of the year too, right? And they agreed to that, and they booked a lot of really funny Native comedians on the show that are going to be on the next little bit. And then I'm going to be brought back in a couple of weeks to talk about the Garfield go-karting game. So yeah, shout out for Garfield Kart. He hates Mondays, right? I don't know. But I think that I'm somebody that, coming up through comedy, I've realized that being one of very few Natives to give these opportunities, I'm trying to do everything that I can to kind of like open the door, and like what Warella was saying, and like we said earlier on the panel, to like, you know, build the table and bring the chairs to the table. And I'm doing that by booking a lot of like really good Native American comedy showcases at a lot of like the top comedy theaters in Los Angeles. And these are like the first times that these shows have ever had all Native talent pools and all Native like shows and stuff like that. And you know, like whenever I'm like writing on shows, like I wrote on a Nickelodeon show like last year, and I like, you know, was just in the room like, hey, what if we cast a Native for this role? So, you know, I'm doing what I can to like make my own comedy, but also just to like advocate for Natives in those spaces, because like, if we don't do it, who's gonna do it, right? That's my time.
Awesome. Will you quickly just tell us, who are some of the other Native comedians that are in the space right now?
Oh yeah, I'll do some shout outs. Yeah, so off the top of my head, Janice Schmeeding is a super funny Native comedian. She has a podcast called, what is it called? It's like a body positivity, well, woman of size, yeah, thank you. Yeah, Janice Schmeeding, she's a super funny comedian. Caitlin Jeffers, she's doing some really good stuff. Tyler Clare. I'm basically naming the entire Rutherford Falls writers group. That's a show headed by Sierra Ornelas, which is, I think, the first like Native EP show for like an NBC thing. They're currently working on it right now. And then like Jim Rule, gotta give a shout out to him. He's a Native who's been hustling for a while, and he's doing a lot of really funny stuff. So there really are like, you know, off the top of my head, I can name like several dozen super funny Native comedians that like, you know, are all killing it and are all doing a lot of great stuff out there. And like, seeing stuff like that makes me really optimistic for the future of Native comedy, because like the talent pool's there, and every time that I do a Native comedy show, it's like a standing room only sellout, so like the interest is there. So like, for me, like 2020 is our year. Like, stuff's gonna happen. We're really building up, and it's awesome to see.
Well, thank you so much. And comedy, I think, is a really important genre in particular, you know, and, you know, several of us on this panel work in social realism, and we work in drama, we work in spaces that are much more kind of serious, and just, you know, my chosen form, and I'm definitely the genre of social realism. It's like, you know, aesthetically speaking, or in terms of cinema, is what most compels me. But I recognize that it's important for us to play with genre, and maybe even be in the process of redefining and kind of claiming genre in different sorts of ways. So I'm curious in terms of, you know, Michelle, your show is genre. You know, Trickster is a genre show, and I'm curious how you worked with genre on your television series in a way that was very specific to coming at it with an Indigenous lens.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of set the context up for the series is based on a trilogy of books, the third which is being written right now, but the first two which have been published and have been sort of bestsellers, award-winning books in Canada. The author is Eden Robinson, and she's Haisla Halsuk, and from like the west coast of British Columbia in Canada. And so it's a very specific, you know, as we all do, it's very specific cultural references in her book. And basically the idea is the 17-year-old kid, Jared, is really battling with addiction. He's also living in a community where resource development is intense. A $1 billion pipeline is going to go through, and natural gas terminal is going to go through his lands, but he's not a political kid. He's just trying to get by day to day. And he starts sort of hallucinating what we think are drug trips, but we quickly come to realize that it's not that. He's the son of the mythological figure Trickster, and he can't deny who he is because it starts to kind of overwhelm him. And so for me, genre, as much as it's cool to have monsters and all sorts of creatures coming into the world of our show, it's very much rooted in Haisla traditions, the storytelling, which we worked with the author to make sure we had permissions and that we were honoring those stories and only kind of inviting the stories in that we had permission to tell, as well as taking dramatic liberties with that. And then that genre we specifically used to make, I would say, pretty specific statements, and I think I'm proud to say bold statements about the effects of colonization on Native peoples. And so for me, genre is a really great way to invite people to be entertained while also kind of having an underlying message. And it's a big FU to colonization, I'd like to say.
Dennis, your film is also a genre film. When I say genre film, I mean it's something that is essentially, I mean, we sort of use genre in the American, you know, film industry to reference something aside from straight drama. So genre in a sense, and oftentimes when you use genre, it will imply that it's a thriller, but I'm talking about genre as, you know, its literal meaning, which is the different styles of filmmaking. Your film is a genre film, sci-fi film, right? And tell us a little bit about that. And, you know, is that the kind of storytelling you wanted to make? Was it the story that took you to genre? What was your journey there?
Well, your point about social realism, like that's my first love, and I feel like when I started to get out on the festival circuit and see social realist films, like I remember seeing Wasp, the Andrea Arnold short, here at the festival, and it blew me away. I think it was in 2004, like the power of seeing those stories, and it just opened up a door where I was like, this is it, like this is our way in, and I could see the relationship between that aesthetic and the way we could tell stories. And so I sort of feel like some of my earlier work was more in that vein, or like really observational, really quiet. And then the last short I made, kind of like, I just cracked it open, and I made it as a part of a commission, so I was invited to do something, and I was kind of scared of touching the kind of oral stories or the characters from oral stories, because I feel like, I mean, I think as Indigenous filmmakers, we're countering 100 years of misrepresentation, and we think about that a lot. And I think our stories are also treated as though there's these quaint, folkloric little tales that are really cute. And I just kind of wanted to throw that all away and see if there was a way that I could bring these characters to life in a way that interested me, which was to give them gravity and also to create a world that felt grounded. And so I feel like I started thinking about how, you know, the aesthetic of social realism can be extended. So you come into a grounded world, and then you just extend into fantastical elements. And to me that was super exciting, because the fantastical elements could be anything. So you were no longer confined by what's real. You could go anywhere. And I also feel like, you know, in so many of our cultures, there are stories that you know, that like on Michelle's show Trickster, there's these mythological, you know, monsters and like amazing things to tap into. And so it's so rich, and if we can find ways of bringing that to life in interesting ways, I think it can be amazing. And so for Night Raiders, it's like I very much feel like I'm in a grounded space, and then and then what are the ways in which you just intersect with something fantastical. And yeah, I'm also curious about how, you know, we don't draw such hard borders between something that's called fantasy or myth. I mean, in our culture, it just is. And so I don't present it in a way that is outside of what's real. And I think that's really interesting about what we can do as Indigenous filmmakers.
Can you just tell us the premise of Night Raiders? Just tell us sort of what the film is about.
Yeah, it follows a mother and daughter on the run. They're Cree. It imagines a post-war North America where children are property of the state, and they're on the run, and they're trying to keep on hiding from the authorities. And when they're forced into the city, the mother is forced to give up her daughter, and then later realizes that might have been a mistake. And so she intersects with a group called the Night Raiders, who are underground Cree vigilantes that live off the land, and they steal children back from the academies one by one. And so if she's going to get her daughter back, she has to align herself with them.
That's amazing. And is it an original script?
Yeah.
Wow.
It took 6 or 7 years to write.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. That's amazing. Okay, well we can't wait to see it here next year.
Yes.
Totally. Amanda, so let's talk about genre for a moment, because I mean, would you consider your genre to be realism, or realism that's elevated? What do you think about things in this way, and what's your, you know, how would you describe your own, you know, your own cinema?
It's funny, I talked about it earlier today, because I think for Sami Blood, it was pretty clear to me in a way. It's, I mean, social realism, I guess, but it felt more like I was collecting memories for years from elders in my own family and other families that have been to these boarding schools, and some that have now changed identity and never come back, and some who are still living in a more traditional way and still back home. And so I was interviewing them, and it's sort of their images. So I think that film is shot like it's memories. And this film is as well, and I don't know. I guess it is kind of memories. Also because both of these films, and that doesn't go for all my shorts, but they feel like more collective films in that sense, that they don't just come from me. It's more of of course, I'm the director, I'm the screenwriter, but I have to take care of these stories and have a responsibility to do that. And it was very collaborative in many ways, also with the cast, and we had a lot of discussions about everything, about every knife that is used and who's owning it for real, and why we can or cannot use it, and you know, all those things that can be important. And also the image, well, of course I chose the images, but they come from people telling me them. And of course some of the scenes are my personal experiences today, but could have taken place in the 30s. And this film now is as well, and I think maybe that's why it looks a little bit like a memory. Because I was interviewing for some years both people in my own family, but then also parents, and especially mothers who have lost their children or abducted them. And in Sweden you get 2 to 4 years of prison if you abduct your own kids, and you're not allowed to do that. And you will probably not get them back after that. so it's also their memories, I guess. So I don't know, I guess that's a heightened reality in a way.
So it is kind of it's a genre of, it's a kind of realism of memory, in a way.
Yeah.
And so with Sami Blood, that story tells a story of, you know, children that are put into the boarding school system in Northern Europe, in this case Northern Sweden, but the same for the Sami people who are in Northern Norway, Northern Finland, parts of Russia. So those stories of the boarding school system, similar to there being a boarding school system here in North America, in the US, and in Canada for the Indigenous people. Did you work with people who had been in the boarding school system that were either in your family or in the community, and sit with them and actually take in those stories? Was that part of your process? Were you collecting stories in that way when you describe it as memories?
Yes, I was actually filming them, but I never intended to release that. It was more, I mean, they're so old now. I mean, we have these boarding schools. Actually, the boarding schools were closed when I was a teenager, but they changed the system so Sami language was allowed maybe in the 90s or 80s, and it also changed in this, yeah, and it also changed in the 60s or 70s, so it was, I mean, it's been gradually changing, of course. It was more based on a race biology nasty background when it started, and then it has gradually changed, and now it's a Sami board and so on, so it's different now. But yeah, I was afraid they would die soon, and some of them that I interviewed in the process in my family and others were not alive when the film was finished. Yeah, so I felt I had to collect. The memories also is so hard to talk about. So it was. And in the beginning, they couldn't understand what I would do with this. Why I would have to look into this again, or like why are we picking in those wounds? But I felt that I mean I've always known the stories from these schools and the people that are left and change identity because it's in my own family and the people are still there, fighting for their rights, but then. It was like that part of history didn't exist because we didn't read about it in school. No one really talked about it. Not so much at home, even though we know. So I had to make a film to make it real. Yeah.
That's interesting. Thank you so much. I commend you for all of that. Willie, so one of the reasons we talk about genre is that genre is, when we're talking about an Indigenous lens, genre is a kind of vehicle, you know, into this distinction. Genre is a container. So it's one of the reasons why I'm coming at the conversation, you know, in that capacity. It's very interesting how we tell our stories, and we have to make choices as filmmakers about how we're going to step into a story, how we're going to film it, what the tone is, and all of these things are a really important part of, you know, how we weave a story. In the case of Beast, the film that that you guys just wrapped on, my understanding was that there was a very interesting process of working with a group of youth who were non-professional actors. They had not acted previously. So there was a genre process, there was a rehearsal process. And does the film have kind of a documentary style? Is it social realism?
A little bit, yeah, because when we were talking about, you know, with Riley and Gina, like the intention was that we didn't want it to feel documentary style. We didn't want it to feel like it was handheld, and so it was really intentional that, you know, even from the beginning of conversations, like we wanted to have Steadicam. We wanted to have things on to feel cinematic, to really bring people into this story, which, in a way, I mean, it is commentary on real life, you know, and real life stories of people and experiences that happen on Pine Ridge. And, you know, it's a challenging story, but also has a lot of humor and heart. And I think one of the really beautiful things that came out of this is we were casting, and it was a really long casting process, and it wasn't like an open call. It was more like really looking for community members to fill these roles. Was that they really became and really brought life to these stories in a way that I think really just blew everyone away, right? Because when you read something or when you hear a story, you get impacted by, you know, the heaviness of, you know, how the story is being told. But then when you have a 13-year-old who's in this role, who has never acted before, fully just living and being and telling this story, and also being conscious of the story that he's telling, like that was so huge for me, just being someone from Pine Ridge and knowing that there is a lot of young talented people out there and young talented storytellers, and how incredible this opportunity was to be a vehicle and a resource for them to elevate their voices and to kind of get into this world and this work. And I think that's what really draws me to producing as well, is being able to recognize your own relationships and how you can bring people together and really make stories happen.
That's awesome. I think that for, you know, a lot of folks who are making films in the community, you're working with people who perhaps are non-professional actors. Might even be, I mean, I cast my dad as God in the movie. And he told me I was typecasting. So, you know, I think that there's a really amazing process to work with people who perhaps are non-professional actors, and to create a space where the performer can actually find freedom. And Shandine, in your film, Mud, which is really beautiful and has beautiful performances, I'm curious about how you created that balance in terms of creating a space for your performers to really be able to go. And they're also going to pretty serious places, you know, in terms of the emotion of the film. So I'm curious how you created that space.
Yeah, I guess I'm not really, I wouldn't call myself like a writer, because I come from a space of cinematography and really visual language and that sort of thing. So I feel like that's my strong suit. So when it came to performances, I was really worried that I wouldn't be able to like let any of that come across. And so what I did was try to set my actors in a very like visual space of like, what are the things that come across like on screen that make you feel and make you like, what are these like tiny little things that you never get to try, and like these little instances in really like micro movements, like that sort of thing, that really feel like you're performing what you understand to be the theme. And so with Mud, it was themes of addiction and what that means to the person who's addicted and those who are surrounded. And so he's trying to paint a portrait that wasn't a stereotype, and really trying to invest in all of these different characters and understand like, what does that mean for them. And so for the main character, it was visuals, and it was the physicality of Mud. And so it was coming from a more surrealistic space of like, we don't know what this character feels or sees normally, and so we're going to take this stereotype and we're going to internalize it and show it through visuals by like showing actual mud on her and like what that means. And so with Mud, Hush Klishni means Mud Clan in Navajo, and then there's like the physicality of Mud. So for Trini, my actor who was playing Ruby, it was about weaving in and out of those spaces of like, what does Mud in Navajo mean? Like, what does Hush Klishni mean? Which is culture, love, family, belonging. And what does like Mud, which is like the modern interpretation of like how people are viewing you. It's like sticky, like you can't wash it off, you can't do all of these things. And so it's like, how can we portray that on a screen where people can't, like, it's a short, so you don't have the time to invest fully. And so it's like, how do you do that in that short amount of time? And you use cinema to the best of its capability by using music, like visuals, like everything in your favor to like try to understand these really hard things that we all have to go through, but also like portraying something that's honest and feels real. That way, when you're showing it to non-Indigenous audiences, they understand both like with the story, but they understand viscerally too. And it's not just like, oh yeah, like this is a story about an alcoholic lady. It's like, no, like I feel like I don't know what I'm feeling, but I feel something. So I try to, like, I want to take that approach with like most of the films that I hope to do, but and working as a cinematographer, I try to understand that from directors who are like trying to show something that can't be spoken.
That's beautiful. Thank you. So Joey, I have a question for you about just, it is about genre, because you're a comedian, you're working in the comedy space. There's an adage that, you know, a friend of mine who, you know, has been a comedian for a long time once said, you know, comedians are some of the saddest people, you know. And there is, you know, like high rates of suicide, you know, amongst comedians. There's a sort of legacy of that. And so, you know, there is, I know that all comedians feel very deeply. And I'm curious, as you, as a writer, if there's also those moments when what's coming from you is actually, you know, much more serious and much more kind of, you know, sincere in terms of the characters and stories that are coming to you. Like, what's your process as a writer?
Oh, wow, that's a big question. Okay, so as a writer, I feel like I mean, it kind of depends on the job and the script. There are some things, you know, if you're writing a sketch about like a police officer that farts too much or something, I'm not necessarily bringing my emotions to that. I'm just like, oh, okay, cool, so he farts more, great, 3 pages and we're out. But I think specifically when I'm writing about personal stories and things from the Native experience, I always like, I try to come from a place of like, what are the stories that I've always wanted to see on screen? And then specifically with Native stuff, how can I do right by like myself and also like other Natives? Because, you know, like I do understand that I'm in a fortunate position where I'm like one of few Natives that gets opportunities in the all-comedy space. So I know that like, when I'm in these spaces, that like, I'm not just speaking for me, I'm like put in a position where I kind of am speaking for everybody. So like a good personal example is I've recently developed a pilot that I'm getting ready to pitch places that's about a bunch of Native American high schoolers who are working really hard to get their high school to change their racist Native American mascot. And that's like my first time ever writing a dramedy script. And it's like, that's something where like I went to a high school with a stereotypical Native American mascot. Like I definitely, you know, was in like a lot of Native clubs and like had a lot of friends who were like working really hard to get the high school to change their mascot and, you know, get people to stop doing the tomahawk chop and stuff. So whenever I'm writing about stories like that, specifically from like, you know, underrepresented groups, I'm like, man, I want to do right by those people. Like I want my friend Rochelle Freiberg, who like was fighting so hard, you know, when I was going to high school in Marysville. I want her to watch that and feel like, you know, dating myself, but I graduated in 2002, so, you know, 15 years later. I want her to watch that and feel like, wow, like the fight that I fought made a difference. Or like, wow, I feel like my story was like said in a way that like, you know, ultimately like gets the goal that like we're all going for, which is like good Native representation. So, you know, it's just like really tapping into like that with comedy is like, it's just like being honest and like, you can have jokes, but like, instead of coming from a place of ironic detachment or a place of negativity, come from a place of like, you know, make the thing funny, but also like, be honorable to the subjects of your material and the characters that you're writing about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I'm so excited that you wrote a pilot.
Oh, thanks.
Awesome.
Oh,
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I should say, you should give me notes on it or whatever.
Just send it to me, yeah.
Yeah, making deals, Hollywood.
Right on stage. The panel that comes after this at 2 o'clock is with Crystal Echohawk, who's the founder and executive director of Illuminative and who created this space with Elizabeth and Eric and Gateway. And that panel is going to go a little bit deeper into some of the research that Illuminative is founded on. The conversation is going to be as well with Tulane Jones, who's the president of Array and DuVernay's company, and then Sterling Harjo. And that conversation is going to look deeper into the reality of our industry and, you know, some of the grave statistics that came out of the research showing the levels of invisibility, in particular for Native people in the United States and American media. Our industry is a colonial structure. Like it is, you know? And so in order to do what we're all doing, in order to do the work that you're doing, you are decolonizing methodology. You know, there's a decolonizing process in terms of how you were creating your stories and how you were, you know, navigating your journey as storytellers. And so I just want to kind of popcorn the question that, what are some of the ways and were there moments when you realized that you were actually in an instance of decolonizing your own process, or in turn, indigenizing your own process? Like, were there moments that are sort of actual threshold moments or peak moments when you realized that there was something shifting within your own process? Does that make sense?
I mean, I can speak on that. So recently, when I started doing these Native comedy shows, a lot of my goal in the comedy community is just try to like get as many Native comedians, one, showcased as possible, but also to build the talent pool of Native comedians that are out there by showcasing people. And I'm trying to do everything that I can to make the Los Angeles comedy community, you know, a welcoming space for Natives. Because if you don't necessarily see people like you on stage, you don't necessarily feel like those are spaces that you can participate in. So in November, I just kind of like threw down the gauntlet for the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater and just said like, hey, you guys should have a land acknowledgement plaque for like the Tongva people like outside your theater. And they said, hey, we never thought about that. That's a great idea. And they hung it up yesterday, and now it's in front of the UCD Theater, and there's a land acknowledgement plaque. And I've, you know, since then, because like Hollywood is how it is, a bunch of other comedy theaters in Los Angeles have now reached out to me and said, hey, can we do that too? So it's even just like the smallest thing that like, if you're a Native, you see that and you're like, oh, I'm like welcome in this space. So that's a way that I'm trying to just kind of like, you know, decolonize comedy as much as I can.
That is so awesome. Yeah, just popcorn it whenever you
I'll
can.
just be quick. I just, when we did Trickster, we had, like, we budgeted to have an elder who was on set with us, and so that elder would, we had like opening ceremony and a closing ceremony for the production, but we also had a couple of dates where all non-Indigenous and Indigenous crew were invited to sweat lodges. We had a smudge kit that was always available on set. And we also had storytelling lunchtime sessions where it was up to you if you wanted to go, but the elder would talk about stories that, being on set, he would notice things, maybe impatience for one thing, and he would then tell a story over lunch about patience and what that means. And so I felt that that was a really powerful way of sort of including our processes within a larger structure of a TV series. One of the other things I remember when I was directing actually on a show that was not my show, I was just hired to be an episodic director. We were filming at a prison that had been shut down, and one of the grips, actually, he was from the community, and he said, we shouldn't be on this land, that's a burial site over there. And immediately, one of the executive producers was an Indigenous company, and he shut the production down immediately. We brought an elder in, and we did a ceremony on that land, and then they put sort of boundaries where the trees were, where the burial ground was, and instructed nobody's allowed to go there. And I just thought that recognition of the land we're on, the stories we're telling, what we're doing, to respect that, even in a mainstream production, like for the CW network, millions of dollars, and you're going, no, this is important. And we're going to interrupt our process, not even interrupt it, we're going to integrate our process so that we can honor and recognize this. And I think for me, that is what having Indigenous people in sort of leadership positions on productions, that's what we can offer.
And to build off of that, for me, it's been about, you know, just operating as an Indigenous person on projects, and I think you're referencing Beast is, you know, I think it's this idea and this concept of trusting in those Indigenous voices and giving them, like was said, leadership roles, and really deconstructing this sort of very linear, sort of top-down way of creating stories. You know, you kind of have your top-level positions and the people at the bottom. That's kind of how the colonial system of, you know, sort of this sort of male-dominant, white supremacist filmmaking industry can be. And so it's really about deconstructing that and really thinking about it through an Indigenous lens. And a lot of the times that's in sort of this circle or this spiral, and things move together in that. And so for me, it's always been about recognizing that and recognizing, yeah, there may be titles or in those certain positions, but also acknowledging that at certain times there's people who are part of that circle that will step forward and lead. And that's kind of how we've always been, at least for as Lakota people, is thinking in that way of like when we form our communities and we make decisions, it's usually in sort of that circle way and getting consensus. And sometimes that can be hard, and I think the process of decolonizing or indigenizing these spaces is that it's really hard and it's tough work, and that there's a lot of trauma there there needs to be space for that healing and recognizing that we're healing. And I think, you know, for example, on Beast, you know, we had these young kids who've never acted before, dealing with really tough material that was triggering. And so there would be days that they just weren't feeling good. And we were in the middle of a shoot, and they were, you know, one kids, but also really carrying this heavy load with them and like trying to figure out how to navigate this space with all these adults, and it was really hard. And so really saying, okay, we're gonna take the time, we're gonna stop, we're gonna reconfigure and give that space and the room to heal. And, you know, like you said, bringing in culture. I think culture and language is a huge part of indigenizing and deconstructing these systems in which we tell stories. And I think for me, that's kind of how I always lead when I enter these spaces, when things can get a little tricky and you feel tension. It's because as Indigenous people, we just operate in that sort of circular movement.
That's so awesome,
So on Night Raider is very similar to Michelle's production. We also had an elder who was representing the land that we were on, open it, and then we had Cree elders as a part of the process, and then we also did an Indigenous mentorship program, so we had Indigenous crew placed in a bunch of different departments, and you know, when they came the day before shooting, we also had an all-staff, like an all-crew training half day right before shooting, where we talked about the colonial history of Canada and how it tied to the story we were telling, so that people understood the context for this particular film. And I feel like, you know, for a lot of non-Indigenous crew, it was really helpful. It gave them a way into it. And then the mentees came in, and one thing that bugs me about mentorship is the idea that it's hierarchical and you're a mentee, that you get bestowed with all this wisdom from mentors. And I always like to think of it as much more of an exchange. So when the mentees came in the day before shooting, I just sat down with them and I just said, you know, we're telling these stories for us first. So this is your space, set is your space first, you can claim it, and so like you never have to apologize for being here, you never have, because you know, sets are very hierarchical spaces, and I think, you know, they come in as the little trainees and they, you know, like it can be intimidating, and I just wanted them to feel ownership there. And actually one day, we were on set and we were doing a really tough scene, and there was an actor really struggling, and I was feeling really emotional, and I just stopped and said, we need a smudge, and I looked, our associate producer was actually, who was Indigenous, Ojibwe woman, Eva Thomas, was offset in that moment, and if it weren't for one of the mentees, like one of our PAs, Lee, who is an amazing person, whose son had given him a smudge like earlier that day, like we wouldn't have had immediate access to that, and I just didn't feel good about going forward until we were able to do it. And so it's also being empowered to say stop, because film sets are super run on time, and like every minute costs whatever, and so you have to be able to stop things when they need to stop, and also work with key members of your team that understand the cultural values that are driving those decisions. So our first AD, Rob Cotterill, who was non-Indigenous, but he's like, you know, really tapped into kind of social justice, and he's actually a producer on a film at the festival called Possessor. But this one day, an actor was triggered by something and was having like a PTSD response, and so I took her aside, I took her away, and I just like created this little, I just told her, I'm just gonna stand here with you, and we're gonna stand here for as long as we need to, and no one's gonna come near you right now, and like, you know, you just kind of create this like barrier of protection. And the first AD came over to me, and he looked at me, and I just nodded my head, and he just turned around and walked away. So, you know, we have to just like, and I think especially for actors, I mean, they're bringing their lived experience to what they're doing. It's not like it's some make-believe pretend thing, and I think as directors, like, we have to protect that.
That's one of my beliefs. Oh, sorry, Shanti, please.
I guess one of the biggest things that I think that you guys have all spoken about is like this hierarchical structure that is like very colonial when it comes to like the film industry. And I guess speaking a little bit on a side of like not really being in a position of power to like make like this space of indigeneity, but like carrying that with you when you go to like meetings or like that sort of thing, when people are like, oh yeah, this is like a diversity initiative, you're here as like the Native American person, and like really speaking back like against that and telling them like it's wrong to put me here in this place where you're trying to get me to fulfill a role of this thing that it's like we're so much more complex than that. And I guess kind of an example of that was when I was hired to do a short doc on Deb Holland with National Geographic, and they came and they're like, oh yeah, these are like the questions that we want to ask, and this is like the narrative that we're trying to achieve, which is a bold Native American woman who is like fighting against everything. And when we were interviewing her, it was like, that's not Deb Holland's story. Like, Deb Holland is so much a person of like her community, and she is so invested in a way that's like pushing herself back. And so I was really asking questions to her, like as like, what do you think this means, and like what does it mean to be in a position of power, and really like showcasing that story of indigeneity, and like saying like, yeah, her slogan is be fierce, but I was like, what does be fierce mean to you? It means like I'm stepping back, I'm quietly pushing people up, instead of being that upfront person who's like yelling, and you can be that too, it's not wrong, it's just like showcasing that there is like there's a spectrum of indigeneity, and it's not always this like huge loud thing. Like there's so many important, quiet, like soft, like stories and themes that need to be heard, but like they're never gonna get the light of day if all you're focusing on is just like yelling.
Yeah, it was so inspiring to hear this, and it gives me some new like energy to go back home and continue to be this sometimes difficult director. I think we do many of the same things. We also had a course or workshops and lectures for the non-native team and together with the native, like indigenous team. But I think it really makes a difference when there are people high up in the hierarchy, like a director or producer from the community, because I don't know what it's like where you're from, but at least in the Sami context, not saying anything means you don't agree. But like in a Western context, it means you agree. So we had to try to teach this non-indigenous team that like your team members and the cast will not tell you if it's wrong. But fortunately, we talked about it so they could come to me. Also, I think it was really important because of this history with like misrepresentation, misunderstandings, misuse, and I mean all kinds of horrible things that has happened, and it really hurts just to be misunderstood. I thought it was really important that also the really small parts read the whole script, and they had notes on everything, especially the older cast. And the producers couldn't maybe really understand that in the beginning, because normally you wouldn't do that if someone comes in for one scene, that they read the whole thing and have comments on everything. But I felt like, no, we have to do it that way, because people don't want to be in something where you feel like like it's misrepresenting like your people or yourself or your ancestors. So that was really good because we had a lot of good discussions about, I wanted the language to be the 1930s South Sami, and today the language is different, so like we had all these like specific discussions. And also the meaning of the land, because I wanted to film in this place where I'm from and where my family lives, because I feel I can film there and I know the places, and it's based on only like a traditional song about this specific mountain. Is like going through the whole film. It's the same Volje, traditional song that everyone sings, but in their own version. All the characters in the film. And also it's the score. So I wanted to film there, and it meant we lost millions of crowns because we couldn't film in the regions where you get more money. We had to film in my poor region. Yeah, I'm really happy we could do that, and that they respected that. And they even respected that we had an elder with us who, in the cast, who had this vision that we shouldn't go and film in one place, and was really, really worried. So in the end, I felt I couldn't bring them there. I didn't want to take the team there. So we had to, yeah, that would got to be really expensive. We had to find a similar mountain somewhere else, and that should match the environment, and redo the whole thing, and like set it up with all the extras and everything. So I'm really happy I got the chance, and like the trust from the producers to that this was important. I don't know if they understood why, but they respected that that decision had to be made, because well, in my family you have to respect that.
Joey.
Hi, I just wanted to piggyback on a couple of things that were said. I think that one of the keys to help like decolonize and re-indigenize the entertainment industry is, I mean, like was mentioned earlier, like putting Native people in decision-making and leadership roles on projects. Like the amount of times that I and a lot of my friends in Native Hollywood have been like emailed very stereotypical, like racist scripts about Native stuff, clearly not written by a Native, with the thought being like, hey, will you read this and tell me if it's offensive? And they really just, they're looking for a no, but the answer is always yes. Like, I think, I used to be very polite when I would get scripts like that, because like, you know, you don't want to make enemies in Hollywood or whatever. But lately, I've started to just be super honest with people. Like, I almost have like a copy and paste at the bottom of the message that's just like, hey, one, if this is a project about Natives, I'm Cowlitz, this is about like a Cree woman, maybe talk to a Cree person about this, and not just a Native person. You know, don't just write your thing and the first person that sees your script that's a Native person is the actor on set. You should have, you know, like Native producers on your films. You should have like a Native co-writer to help like flesh out the story. You should have like, you know, like let's go crazy, a Native director on your Native project. Like, I think that to me is so much of the key, is just like people realizing that it's not okay to write a script about Native subject matter or Native stories, at no point talk to any Natives about it, send it to one Native who you do not pay to read the script and give you notes on it, and then shoot it with maybe Native actors playing Native roles. Like, I don't know, it's just like challenging people to do better, right?
That's awesome. Yeah.
I just want to say, like in Australia, they have the Pathways and Protocols document, and in Canada, we have, it was very exciting, groundbreaking, that the Indigenous Screen Office, which advocates for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous stories in the film industry, it opened last year, and they worked on a Pathways and Protocols document with a number of other, Imaginative being one, and Telefilm, and they worked on this Pathways and Protocols document, which is, it's funny because in this colonized world, it's like people seem to understand something that's written down with chapters and bullet points, but it's been a really useful document to sort of unite Native and non-Native creators, because what I found what was happening with me is that I would get a non-Native producer coming up to me who's like, so I've got this story, and people say it's not okay. Do you think it's okay if I do this? And it was like, I'm not speaking for all Native people. Like, and then it's like, but if you say it's okay, then I can do it. Like, they just wanted permission to go ahead and do something that, And I was so uncomfortable with that, but now I can say, listen, have you read the Pathways and Protocols document? This is a legit document, you know, it's how many hundreds of pages that identifies some of the key areas of how to work with the Native community, how to work with Native creators, and what are those protocols. And so that's been, I found, really useful and transformative in the industry.
We are going to shift into just giving some time to have, to have a conversation, a few questions. There's another panel coming up at 2 o'clock with Illuminatives, Crystal Echohawk, and the prolific writer-director Sterling Harjo, film and television, and Tulane Jones, who is the president of Ava DuVernay's company, Array, and it's moderated by Bridget Antoinette Evans, who heads up Pop Culture Collaborative. So we've got one more conversation to come and a short film we're going to screen before that. But I want to ask Janice to just close us out with some thoughts. Because you have this background of having programmed and been a curator, you come at this with a distinct kind of generosity of spirit. You have been in the business of helping others, and not everybody's up to that, and that's okay. We don't have to, but there is something about bringing everyone together. Ava DuVernay is an extraordinary example of that, and so I feel like, in thinking about what we're all up to and what we're trying to do, what are your thoughts about how we continue to build on this and to build on everything we've discussed? And all of your thoughts were amazing, right? I mean, everybody's thoughts were just really incredible, and I'm so appreciative, I'm so inspired by the conversation, and thank you. But I just would like to hear, what you think about just how do we continue to do this?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the most powerful thing that's helped me through really challenging times when you feel like isolated as a writer or whatever is honestly this community that comes together. And when I say community, it's an umbrella for many Indigenous communities, and I feel like for years we've been meeting at events like Sundance, which has always had a really essential and amazing Indigenous component, and then Imaginative, and then there are other festivals that got on the train and gave us these opportunities to gather. But I would say, our peer groups are some of the most powerful things that support us through the time. And I feel like often we can feel a lot of pressure to come to events and connect with very important industry people. And networking is important, but I feel like for me personally, I've leaned more on, this community of people, of like-minded folks, because at the end of the day, we're passionate about these stories because we're coming from a different perspective. And I think, it's so important to value what we bring to the table and not feel like we're outside of something, that there's a real power in what we're bringing. And, I've been around the Indigenous film world, I started in film on a set in the 90s. So I've been around for a really long time, and I feel like we are in a moment right now where we have never been before, and I've never been more excited. There's more of us out here than ever before, and the next few years, the next decade is gonna be through the roof. So we stick together, and we're gonna, it's really exciting.
Thank you so much. We have time for just a couple of questions or thoughts. So is there anybody that just wants to bring something to the conversation?